back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of 1968. We've been talking about the role of black athletes around the world in 1968, and particularly the Olympics of 1968. In this lecture, I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about the kinds of things that black athletes in the United States were protesting about, and the movement that began to blossom and point towards a possible boycott of those 1968 Olympics, known as the Olympic Project for Human Rights. In the previous lecture, I mentioned some of the issues that black athletes in the United States confronted over the decades following World War II, and some of the issues they had to protest by the late 1960s. I also talked about the growing militance and the inclination towards black power that many of these athletes showed during that period. In late 1967, these beliefs began to coalesce into a movement, which was first organized by a man named Harry Edwards, a sociology professor and track athlete and track coach at San Jose State University. Edwards is one of the instantly recognizable figures of 1968. He cast an imposing figure, standing some 6'8", and often wearing a black beret, black leather jacket, black sunglasses. He was a very intimidating figure. He himself had been very successful in the discus, approaching at times world-class distances. And during that time, he was a sociology professor and assisted with coaching track at San Jose State. So not only did he have some of the athletes in the classroom where he taught them about the various issues and shifting beliefs of the time, but he also had them on the track and out in the field where he could train them further. And so it was under the tutelage of Harry Edwards and at San Jose State University that this movement began to blossom. One of the prominent athletes under Harry Edwards was Tommie Smith, one of the best sprinters in the world, and we'll talk more about him as we get to the Olympic events themselves. But he really kind of sparked significant controversy when he was asked about a possible boycott of the 1968 Olympics. And in response, he said, "Yes, this is true. Some black athletes have been discussing the possibility of boycotting the games to protest racial injustice in America." That was in the fall of 1967, and a number of other athletes joined in the chorus, and Harry Edwards himself and others on the campus of San Jose State, notably one of his graduate students named Kenneth Noel, began to organize protests on the campus. They organized marches and protests on the first day of classes and around the first football game of the season. And in October of 1967, Edwards and Noel and others in the group formed the Olympic Project for Human Rights. The group pointed broadly at a boycott of the 1968 Olympics, but they also developed other goals and demands. They issued 6 specific demands within the first few months of being formed. First, they sought the restoration of the heavyweight title of Muhammad Ali, which I mentioned briefly in the last lecture. They demanded that Avery Brundage be removed as the head of the International Olympic Committee. And I've talked about Brundage a time or two before as well. They also demanded the inclusion of more black coaches and administrators throughout the American sporting system. They also demanded the desegregation of the New York Athletic Club, which was one of the prominent sponsors of athletic meets, and they held one of the most prominent and important track meets in the country. As they began to take their protests more broadly than just the campus of San Jose State University, the Olympic Project for Human Rights organizers pointed towards a boycott of the New York Athletic Club meet in February of 1968. And again, this was one of the most important track meets in the country. It brought athletes and teams from all over the country and, in fact, all over the world. Many black athletes joined the movement to boycott the New York Athletic Club. And by coincidence, the day that the meet was set to begin was the same day that the International Olympic Committee announced that South Africa would be reinstated into the Olympics. And so that global sports movement combined with the African American sports movement and drew huge attention to the launch of that athletic meet in New York. And you see a picture there at the bottom. Huge crowds gathered around Madison Square Garden where the meet was to be held. It was a very intimidating and frightening scene in some ways for black athletes, even those who wanted to compete and sort of cross the line, such as Bob Beamon, the long jumper, who did compete in the meet. He just considered himself kind of removed from the politics of all of this. But many other black athletes did boycott the movement. Many teams around the country and around the world did not come. And so the meet actually carried on, but without a lot of the prestige that was typically associated with it. And so it was considered a success and motivated and fueled the Olympic Project for Human Rights to conduct other protests. And so very quickly that spring, boycotts and protests spread to college campuses and various track meets all over the country. And so this is the so-called Revolt of the Black Athlete, which is the title of a book written by Harry Edwards about this period, that this protest rapidly spread all around the country, and there were protests and boycotts, it seemed, almost everywhere. Black athletes who participated in these protests drew the ire of white critics all over the country, and in many cases suffered a backlash from their white coaches and teammates as well. They received horrific hate mail filled with racial slurs and, in some cases, death threats. Many of them really aren't suitable to read in a lecture like this, but just as one example, Lee Evans received a letter that said, "Dear traitor, I'd rather have our country finish last without you than first with you." And that's actually a very tame example of the kind of hate mail and threats that the athletes were receiving. The black athletes were also not unified in their approach to the boycott and other protests. I mentioned Bob Beamon, who really just tried to kind of stay out of it and remain above the politics of it. Another long jumper, Ralph Boston, who was the defending Olympic gold medalist in the long jump, said, "What boycott? I've put too much time and effort into track and field to give it up. If I felt there was sufficient reason, I would boycott. But I don't even know what the reason is. At least Negroes have this much. We can compete in amateur sports, and we can represent ourselves and then the country." Prominent former athletes like Jackie Robinson and Jesse Owens also spoke up, and many of them didn't support the athletes boycotting. Jesse Owens said this. He said, "We shattered this so-called Aryan supremacy," this was in 1936, "by our own supremacy and by standing and saluting the American flag. I feel that the deeds of an individual are far more potent than a boycott. There is no politics or racial prejudice in the Olympics. I believe you contribute more by entering than by staying out." As the spring and summer went on, black athletes discussed these issues endlessly, and the idea of potentially boycotting the '68 Olympics became a common talking point among them. Certainly, the IOC decision to reinstate the ban on South Africa, which came in April, further divided the athletes. The protest against South Africa's admission had unified black athletes in the United States, but all around the world as well. Ultimately, Harry Edwards recognized that with so many divisions of opinion among the black athletes, that they really couldn't support a boycott because it wouldn't be unanimous. And so on August 31st, Harry Edwards announced, "The majority of athletes will participate in the Olympics." And that really marked the end of the idea of boycotting the 1968 Olympics. So why did the boycott movement not succeed? Why did it fall apart? Well, probably the most important reason I've just mentioned. There was too much division of opinion While many black athletes did support the idea of a boycott, it was not unanimous. There were many of them who wanted to go on and compete. They had spent their lives training. This was really their goal. And then others of them simply just didn't support or believe in uh, what the black athletes were protesting against. They just didn't think it was important enough to cast aside those dreams and goals that they had had. The boycott movement also suffered, perhaps, because of its constituency. These were militant. They were tied with black power, and so they shared a similar constituency to that movement more broadly, which again I talked about in an earlier lecture in the course. But the Olympic Project for Human Rights was essentially all black. Their core organizing individuals were all black. And while there were whites who were sympathetic to their causes, and ultimately a small number of whites did contribute in some ways, for the most part, the movement was all black. They were also young. I've mentioned that athletes like Jesse Owens and Jackie Robinson, some of the older generation, really couldn't and didn't identify so much with what these athletes were protesting against. And they were all male. And there were many important black female athletes at this time and associated with the 1968 Olympics. And while they were essentially informed of what was going on, they did not participate in those meetings and really didn't have a voice in the decisions that were being made. And incidentally, Harry Edwards himself has kind of recognized that that was one of the shortcomings of the movement, the not reaching out more to female athletes for their contributions at that time. But in some ways, this isolated the movement. The fact that they were all black, or the great majority were black, young, and all male, lost the potential support of whites, older people, and women as well. And so they were sort of isolated. But I think at the end of the day, asking any athlete to boycott any meet is a tall order. And asking athletes to boycott the Olympics is a very, very difficult decision for them. And so while many of them did believe passionately in the cause, this was the Olympics. This was their life dream, and they are driven to compete, and they just couldn't give up on that dream for the sake of this boycott. So, with the boycott itself being called off, and with athletes having made the decision that those who qualified were going to go to Mexico City and were going to compete, it then was left up to them individually to decide what, if anything, would they do at the Olympics. As triple jumper Art Walker said, "I think we still ought to do something anyway to let Black America know we identify." And with those words, Walker suggested something would happen at the Olympics. Some kind of protest was coming. In the next lecture, we'll talk about what that was.